Tonight, we revisit one case that closed a woman's life so quietly that the ground held its secret for nearly 4 years before the record would have it. One farmhouse, one filled-in ditch, one signature copied and copied again, until the copying was all that remained of her that moved through the world. These are facts that entered the national record and has remained there. The case of Camille Cecile Holland begins in the parish of Clavering, in the northwestern corner of Essex, in the closing months of the 19th century and the opening ones of the 20th. It is a country of low chalk and heavy clay, of hedged fields and slow water, lying where the shires of Essex, Hertfordshire and Cambridgeshire fold into one another some 40-odd miles north of the capital. The land here does not announce itself. It is farmland of long standing, worked in the old way, its lanes running crooked between parishes that had kept their boundaries since before the conquest, and its villages small, self-contained, and separated one from another by distances that a man walked or drove behind a pony and did not think remarkable. Clavering itself was, and remains, a village of some antiquity. The earthworks of a vanished castle lie at its heart. The parish church of St. Mary and St. Clement stands in flint and stone above a scatter of timber-framed and thatched cottages, some of them older than any parish register that survives to name their builders. In the years with which this account is concerned, the population was small, numbered in hundreds rather than thousands, and overwhelmingly agricultural in its labor and its outlook. The men worked the land or the trades that served the land, the smith, the wheelwright, the miller, the men who kept the horses and the men who cut the hedges. The chapel and the church divided the Sundays between them. News travelled by mouth and by foot, and a stranger settling in the district was a matter of general and lasting interest. The nearest town of consequence was Saffron Walden, a market town of narrow streets and fine old houses some miles to the northeast, with its corn exchange, its churches, and its weekly business drawing in the farmers of the surrounding parishes. To the west lay Newport, and it was at Newport that the district touched the wider world, for there ran the line of the Great Eastern Railway, carrying travellers south to London and north to Cambridge. A man might take the trap into Newport, board a train, and be in the capital by the middle of the day, and it is worth holding that fact in mind, for the ease with which a person could leave this country, and the ease with which their leaving could be asserted by another, sits at the centre of what follows. The society of such a parish, at the close of the Victorian age, was ordered and legible in a way that the modern reader must take some care to recover. Everyone knew everyone. The labourer knew the farmer, and the farmer knew the parson. Service in a household was a known and public thing, and a maidservant's coming and going was noted in the village as a matter of ordinary account. A man of means settling among them, a retired officer, as he gave himself out to be, with a wife and the money to take a farm and improve it and give freely to the church, was received according to what he professed himself to be, for there was little in the ordinary run of parish life to test the profession against. Respectability was largely a matter of appearance and of generosity, and both of these could be purchased. It is a feature of this case, and one that the record establishes beyond dispute, that a man might live for 4 years in such a community, esteemed and welcomed and thought well of, upon the fortune of a woman he had put into the ground within sight of the houses of the people who esteemed him. The particular property at the centre of this account stood apart even from Clavering's modest gathering of houses. It was called Coldham's Farm, and it lay isolated in the fields, the nearest cottage, something in the order of half a mile distant across open ground. The house was old and had, according to the accounts that gathered around it in later years, once served as the refuge of a highwayman, the kind of story that attaches to lonely houses in lonely country and that requires verification against records that no longer exist. What is not in doubt is its isolation and its situation, for the farm was surrounded on its sides by a system of old water channels, the drainage ditches and the remnant of a moat that had given the surrounding fields their working shape over the generations. It was from these channels that the property would take the name by which the whole country would shortly come to know it. The old moat and the ditches that fed it were, in the spring of 1899, a matter of no interest to anyone. Features of the land, unremarkable, permanent. the sort of thing a farmer means to attend to and does not. One of them was about to be filled in. The victim in this case was a woman named Camille Cecile Holland, and it is a particular and characteristic cruelty of the matter that the surviving record establishes less of her life than of the life of the man who ended it. She was, at the time these events began, a woman of about 56 years, unmarried, and possessed of independent means. The precise circumstances of her birth and early years are not established with certainty in the primary sources most readily recovered. What the record does establish is a woman who by late middle age had arranged her life to her own satisfaction and answered to no one in the ordering of it. By 1898 she was living in Elgin Crescent, in the district of Notting Hill in West London, a respectable address in a respectable quarter, the home of a woman of settled habits and comfortable circumstances. Her fortune was not vast, but it was real, and it was hers. Stocks and shares valued in the accounts of the period at something in the region of £6,000, a considerable sum for the time, together with the income and security that such holdings conferred. She managed these affairs herself. She corresponded with her broker, she understood her own money, she made her own decisions concerning it. This is a matter of importance, because the whole subsequent tragedy turns upon the transfer of that competence and that fortune out of her hands and into another's, and the record is clear that she did not surrender them lightly or all at once. She is known to history almost entirely through the testimony of others, through the witnesses who saw her in her last months, through the landladies with whom she lodged, through the tradespeople who served her, through the relatives who came forward long afterward to identify what remained. There survives no substantial body of her own words, no diary laid open, no correspondence in which she speaks at length of herself. The physical descriptions of her that entered the record came from those who knew her or served her, and they must be understood as the representations of witnesses rather than as any independent portrait. What emerges from those representations is consistent: a woman careful in her dress and her person, particular in her tastes, of small stature, and, the point is made repeatedly in the accounts, attentive to the quality of what she wore upon her feet. She had her shoes made for her, and made well, by a shoemaker who knew her custom. That detail is offered here without weight, as it presented itself at the time, the harmless particularity of a careful woman. It will return. How Camille Holland came to leave her settled life in Elgin Crescent for an isolated farmhouse in the Essex fields is a question the record answers through a single relationship. In the autumn of 1898, she made the acquaintance of a man some 4 years her junior, a man of soldierly bearing and easy address, who presented himself as a suitor and was accepted as one. There is evidence, though it belongs properly to the account of the man himself, that the acquaintance was formed through the medium of an advertisement, that Miss Holland, an unmarried woman of means in her 6th decade, had made known in some form a willingness to marry, and that the man presented himself in answer to it. What is established is that within a short space of months the two were living as man and wife, that they took lodgings together near Brighton, and that under his persuasion she agreed to a step she would not, so far as the record shows, have taken on her own account, the purchase of a country property, chosen by him, in a county where she had no ties and no acquaintance. Even here, and this is the last exercise of the independence that had ordered her whole life, she did not give herself over entirely. The property was to be bought with her money, and she insisted, against his expressed wishes, that the purchase be made in her name, and that the title stand in her name alone. On that point the record establishes she held firm. It was, in the end, one of the few provisions of her own that would survive her to speak on her behalf. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. The man who answered Camille Holland's advertisement, and who had by then arranged the whole shape of her final months, was named Samuel Herbert Dougal. He was born, the record establishes, on the 15th of May 1847 at Bow in the East End of London, the eldest son of a family of no particular distinction, At the age of 19, he enlisted for a term of 12 years in the Royal Engineers, and it is upon his army service that the whole of his later respectability was built. He proved an able clerk and administrator. He was set to survey work with the Ordnance Survey, and he rose in time to the rank of Chief Clerk and Quartermaster Sergeant, a position of real trust in the regimental economy, drawing pay, keeping accounts, and handling the documents and the moneys of the cause. He extended his service and served in total more than 20 years, a substantial portion of them across the Atlantic at the garrison of Halifax in Nova Scotia. He left the army in 1887 with a character built on 2 decades of steady clerical service and the outward marks of a respectable military man. Behind that character, the record establishes a very different history, and it is necessary to set it out plainly because it establishes the pattern into which Camille Holland fell. His first wife died suddenly at Halifax in 1885, without any prior illness that the record notes. Within 2 months he had married again. His second wife died, equally suddenly and equally without explanation, some 3 months after the wedding, and was buried, as the first had been, with notable speed. The proper caution of the record must be observed here. No charge was ever brought in respect of either death, no medical finding of foul play was ever made, and it is not established by any evidence recovered that Dougal had a hand in them. What is established is the pattern of 2 young wives dead within months of one another, and a man who did not linger over either. After the army, his history is one of relationships entered and abandoned, of ventures begun and left in ruin, and of money that belonged to others passing through his hands. He set up home with a widow on the Isle of Wight. He took on a public house in Hertfordshire that was twice visited by fire, the second occasion raising a charge of arson and insurance fraud, of which he was acquitted, though he lost his license over it. He married a 4th partner, a young Irish woman named Sarah Henrietta White, while continuing to form other attachments, and he drew a succession of women into arrangements in which their money became his and their humiliation was public. In 1895, the pattern reached the courts in earnest. He was convicted of forging and stealing cheques and sentenced to 12 months' hard labour. He served most of that sentence not in prison but in an asylum, having attempted, or having feigned an attempt at, suicide, and was discharged, the record notes, perfectly sane. By 1898, at liberty and once more in search of means, he had settled upon the 6th-decade spinster of Elgin Crescent as his next provision. The relationship between Dougal and Camille Holland was therefore, from its inception, not what it was represented to be. To the world of Saffron Walden and Clavering, they were Mr. and Mrs. Dougal, a respectable retired couple come to take up a farm. In fact, they were not married. He was already legally the husband of another woman, and the whole apparatus of their domestic life was a stage set upon her money and directed toward its acquisition. The friction that the record establishes between them in their few weeks together was not the friction of an unhappy marriage, but the friction of a woman beginning, perhaps, to perceive the character of the man she had joined herself to. A woman who had kept the title of her property in her own name, and who was shortly to find that her caution had not been misplaced and had come too late. To understand what happened at Coldham's farm, it is necessary first to establish the ordinary movements of the household, for the whole matter turns upon a single evening and the small domestic facts that surround it. In January of 1899, Miss Holland and Dougal came into the district and lodged, while the farm was made ready, with a Mrs. Wiskin in Market Row at Saffron Walden. On the 22nd of April 1899, some accounts give the 24th, they moved into the property they had renamed Moat Farm. On the 13th of May, they were joined by a maidservant, a young woman named Florence Havies, engaged to keep the house. Florence Havies had scarcely entered service before she became, in the plain language of the record, the object of Dougal's attentions. On the 14th of May, he made advances to her in the kitchen. On the night of the 16th, he attempted to enter her room, and she held her door shut against him and screamed, and Miss Holland came to her. From that night, the 2 women slept in the same room together, for that night and the 2 that followed. This is the state of the household in its final days. A maid frightened, a mistress alerted to something in the man she had brought into the house, and the man himself thwarted and, the record permits us to infer from what followed, resolved. On the evening of the 19th of May 1899, the sequence as reconstructed through the later proceedings was as follows. At about 6:30, Miss Holland and Dougal went out together from the farmhouse in the pony and trap, Dougal driving. What she wore, and the small articles she carried and had upon her person, her clothing, her jewellery, the well-made shoes, would in time become the only means by which she could be known, but on that evening they were simply the dress of a woman going out for a drive as the light lengthened toward the long dusk of an English May. She was seen to leave, she was not seen alive again. At about 8:30, Dougal returned to the farmhouse alone. When Florence Havies asked after her mistress, he said that Miss Holland had gone to London and would return later that night. Through the remainder of the evening, he was in and out of the house. At 1:45 in the morning, he came in finally and told the maid that Miss Holland had not returned and that she had better go to bed. When Florence came down at 7 the next morning, she found him already risen, dressed, and at his breakfast, and he told her that a letter had come from Miss Holland, saying she had gone away on a holiday. It was of no great consequence to Florence, who had already arranged for her own mother to fetch her away from the farm that very morning. Her mother came, Florence took her wages, and she left. She was, as it proved, the last person outside the household to have seen Camille Holland alive, and to carry that knowledge into the world. Of the act itself, the medical evidence, established 4 years later, permits only the flattest of statements, and it is right to make no more of it than the evidence will bear. What the medical evidence established was that Camille Holland died of a single gunshot wound to the head, delivered at close range. The examining authority's opinion was that the injury must have produced immediate insensibility, and that this insensibility would have continued until death. That is the whole of what the primary materials confirm concerning the manner of her death. The sequence by which her body came to lie where it was found, the carrying, the placing, the covering over, is described in the secondary accounts with a confidence the primary record does not wholly support, and it is enough to state what is certain, that her body was concealed on the property, placed below ground in one of the old drainage channels that ran about the farm, and that the channel was thereafter filled in. Within a short time of her disappearance, Dougal had a portion of the old moat and ditch about the farm filled and levelled. To his neighbours, this was the ordinary improvement of a working farm. It was, the record establishes, a grave. For nearly 4 years the concealment held, and the manner of its holding is as much a part of this case as the manner of its discovery. Dougal did not flee, he remained at Moat Farm and he prospered there. He engaged new servants. He installed at the farm the woman who was in law his actual wife, presented to the district as yet another Mrs. Dougal, and he entered into the life of the parish as a man of substance and good works. He attended church. He gave generously toward the enlargement of the churchyard, toward the redecoration of the interior of the church, and the question of how a man with no visible means came to be so free with his money was one that the village, in its charity, did not press. Behind the good works, the record establishes, ran a steady and methodical plunder. He drew upon Camille Holland's bank accounts by means of cheques bearing what purported to be her signature. He sold off her stocks and shares by forged letters to her broker, and he transferred the title of Moat Farm itself out of her name and into his own. That same title she had insisted against him on keeping. The competence she had guarded was, piece by forged piece, transferred entire to the man who had buried her. What undid him at last was not the memory of Camille Holland, but the pattern of his own conduct, which had not altered. A succession of young women entered service at the farm and became, as Florence Havies had nearly become, the objects of his attentions, and one of them, having borne him a child, sought in January of 1903 an affiliation order against him for its support. It was through the ordinary process of that application, a matter of maintenance, of a few shillings a week, that a thread was pulled which unravelled the whole. The information laid before the court revealed that the woman known for years as Mrs. Dougal, the Mrs. Dougal of Elgin Crescent and the farm's purchase, had never in fact been married to him at all. That single discrepancy drew official attention where none had fallen before, and the attention, once directed, found more. In March of 1903, Dougal was charged with forgery, specifically with forging and uttering a cheque, value some £28, purporting to be drawn by Camille C. Holland. And with that charge came, at last and unavoidably, the question that 4 years had buried. Where was Camille Holland? No relative had heard from her in 4 years. Her funds had been drawn down, and her investments sold throughout that silence. The inquiry that had begun as a matter of fraud became a matter of a missing woman, and the 2 lines of inquiry, the forged signature and the vanished signatory, converged upon the one property. On the 19th of March 1903, the police took possession of Moat Farm. The phrase is exact. The officers engaged in the search moved into the farmhouse and lived there for the duration, preparing their own meals and making their own beds. A detective sergeant named Scott, by the report of the county press, acting as their cook. And they began to dig. The digging at Moat Farm went on for weeks, and it very nearly failed. The ground was extensive, the old channels many, and the man who had filled them in had left no map of his work. The searchers opened trench after trench across the grounds while the country watched, and for a long stretch of that labour they found nothing at all. Only the turned earth of a farm, the old drains, the ordinary interruptions of worked ground. There was, the record establishes, a real prospect that the search would be abandoned unsuccessful, that the ground would keep what it had been given, and that the case against Dougal would rest upon forgery alone and never reach the graver charge. It was the identification of the particular ditch that Dougal had caused to be filled, the recovery, from the memory of the work and the lie of the land, of which channel had been levelled and when, that at last directed the spades to the right ground. What had been done to conceal the body became, 4 years on, the very mark that betrayed its place, the one length of old ditch that had been filled in when all the rest had been left, in a season when a woman had gone missing and a man had told the district she had merely travelled away. For the case had by now seized the public imagination entirely, and the scene about the farm took on the character the county newspapers recorded with something between fascination and distaste. Crowds flocking daily to the fields, a great many of them women, oranges and nuts sold as at a village fair, the voices of vendors, souvenir postcards of the farmhouse and its open trenches selling in enormous numbers, sightseers with their cameras hunting for effective snapshots, and relic hunters in still greater number carrying off what they could. A grave was being searched for in the middle of a spectacle. On the 27th of April 1903, after weeks of labour, the searchers found the filled-in drainage ditch, and in it, some 4 feet down, the body of a woman. The remains recovered from the ditch at Moat Farm on the 27th of April 1903 were carried into the conservatory of the farmhouse and there examined. The condition of the body was such as 4 years in the ground would produce, and the plain difficulty that confronted the investigation was one of identification, how to establish, to the certainty that a court would require, that these remains and no others were the remains of Camille Cecile Holland, a woman not seen since May of 1899. The medical examination was conducted by an eminent hand. The remains were examined by Professor Pepper, an expert acting for the Home Office, together with 2 divisional police surgeons, named in the record as Dr. Storrs and Dr. Sprague. The cause of death they established was not in doubt, and did not depend upon the softer tissues that 4 years had taken. The skull carried a single bullet wound, delivered at close range to the head. Professor Pepper's stated opinion, entered into the record, was that such an injury must have caused immediate insensibility, and that this insensibility would have continued until death. Where the condition of the remains imposed its limitations, and it imposed them heavily, the medical men said so, and identification was carried forward not on the flesh, which could not speak, but on the articles that had lain in the ground with the body, and had better survived it. Here the small particularities of Camille Holland's careful life did for her what 4 years of silence had prevented. Her former landlady, Mrs. Wiskin, and a nephew, Ernest Legrand Holland, came forward and identified the garments and the jewellery recovered with the body as those of Camille Holland. And there came forward also her shoemaker, a Mr. Mould, who examined the shoes upon the feet of the remains and identified them, by his own work and by the name they bore, as shoes he had made for Miss Holland. The careful woman who had her shoes made well was known, in the end, by her shoes. The identification thus rested not upon any single certain proof, but upon the convergence of several: the garments, the jewellery, the shoemaker's work, the situation of the grave upon the property she had bought, and the record is candid that it was a convergence, an accumulation of items each pointing the same way, rather than a single incontrovertible fact. On that convergence the coroner's inquest was satisfied, and the remains were accepted as those of Camille Cecile Holland, dead of a gunshot wound to the head. Upon that finding, Dougal was committed for trial. The trial of Samuel Herbert Dougal for the wilful murder of Camille Cecile Holland opened at the Essex Assizes, held in the Shire Hall at Chelmsford, in June of 1903. It was not tried at the Central Criminal Court in London, as some accounts loosely suppose, but in the county town of the county in which the crime was done, before the Assize Court and a Chelmsford jury. The indictment was formal and precise in the manner of its time, that Samuel Herbert Dougal, on the 19th of May 1899, did feloniously, wilfully, and of his malice aforethought, kill and murder Camille Cecile Holland at Clavering. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Wright, Sir Robert Samuel Wright, a judge of the King's Bench of considerable learning. The Crown was led by Mr. Gill, King's Counsel, a prosecutor of the first rank. The public interest, already vast during the weeks of digging, attended the trial in full. The press benches were crowded. The county and national papers gave the proceedings column upon column, and the matter was followed across the country, as few provincial trials were. The case for the Crown was constructed, as the strongest cases of that period were, not upon any single witness to the act, for there was none living but the accused, but upon the assembly of established facts, into a chain that admitted no other reasonable explanation. It may be set out in its several parts as the prosecution set it out. There was first the discovery, the body of a woman, shot once through the head, concealed 4 feet down in a drainage ditch on the accused's own property, in ground that the accused had caused to be filled in shortly after the woman was last seen alive. There was, second, the identification, the garments, the jewellery, and above all the shoemaker's work by which the remains were shown to the court's satisfaction to be those of Camille Holland, the woman who had bought that very property and had not been seen since the 19th of May, 1899. There was, third, the domestic history, the testimony of Florence Havies as to the events of that evening, the drive out in the trap at 6:30, Dougal's return alone, the shifting accounts of London and of a holiday letter, the whole small architecture of a lie told to a servant on the night of a disappearance. And there was, fourth, the conduct of the defendant in the 4 years that followed. A man who did not report a missing woman, but instead forged her signature, drained her accounts, sold her investments, took her property into his own name, and lived upon her fortune while telling the district she had merely gone away. Each part, the Crown argued, might admit of some strained, innocent reading. Together they admitted of none. Against this the defence laboured under the plainest difficulty, which was that the facts themselves were, for the most part, not capable of denial. The concealment of the body on the property, the forgeries, the transfer of the estate, the 4 years of drawn accounts, these were matters of document and of physical discovery, not of contested recollection. The defence directed itself where it could, to the question of identification, and to the question of whether the Crown had truly closed every door but the one it wished the jury to walk through. It did not succeed, and the reason it did not succeed is that the accumulation of established fact left no room for it to succeed. The woman was dead by a bullet. She was in his ground. He had filled the ground, and he had spent 4 years and her whole fortune pretending she was alive. The jury, having heard the whole, retired, and returned after an absence recorded at 56 minutes. The verdict was entered in the formal language of the court. Samuel Herbert Dougal was found guilty of the willful murder of Camille Cecile Holland. The judge assumed the black cap and passed the only sentence the law then allowed, and his words, spoken from the bench and taken down, were the settled formula of that grave office, that the prisoner be taken from thence to the place from whence he came, and from there to a place of execution, and that he there be hanged by the neck until he be dead, and that his body be afterward buried within the precinct of the prison in which he was last confined, and may the Lord have mercy upon his soul. The sentence was death by hanging. It was entered in the official record. Samuel Herbert Dougal was executed at Chelmsford Prison at 8 o'clock on the morning of Tuesday, the 14th of July, 1903. The executioner was William Billington, of the family of Lancashire hangmen, who carried out the greater part of the Crown's capital sentences in those years. The execution was conducted, as the law by then required, within the walls of the prison and not before the public, the practice of public execution having been ended in England more than 3 decades earlier by the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, which removed the hanging of the condemned from the open ground before the gaol to the enclosed precincts within it. Those officially present were the officers of the prison, the attending officials, and the chaplain, in the number and manner that the regulations prescribed. It is upon this morning that the one detail rests for which the case is chiefly remembered, and it must be handled with the caution the record demands. For accounts of a condemned person's final conduct come to us through prison officials and the press, and are not always reliable in their particulars. Through the whole of his imprisonment and trial, Dougal had made no admission of guilt. As he stood upon the scaffold, according to the accounts that came out of the prison and were carried in the press, the chaplain pressed him for an acknowledgment, putting to him the direct question of his guilt, and in the last moment before the drop fell, Dougal is reported to have answered with a single word, guilty. Whether the word was spoken as it was reported, and in the manner reported, the primary materials do not permit us to confirm with certainty. It is the account that entered the record, and it entered it as the confession that 4 years of forged signatures and 4 weeks of digging had failed to obtain from him living. He was buried, as the sentence had directed, within the grounds of Chelmsford Prison, his grave marked only by his initials and a number set into the wall nearby. With his burial, the legal proceedings in the matter of Camille Cecile Holland were, in the formal sense, concluded, and the file was closed. The case entered the historical record at once, and it has never wholly left it. The press had made it a national matter during the weeks of digging, and the trial and execution set the seal upon that notoriety. The Moat Farm murder passed directly into the anthologies and the annals of Victorian and Edwardian crime, and it has been retold, in books, in articles, in novels, in plays, with a persistence that few provincial murders command. The novelist and journalist Edgar Wallace treated it under the title of The Secret of the Moat Farm. Later authors and historians have returned to it repeatedly, among them the historian M.W. Aldridge, in a full modern study of Dougal's life and criminal career, and it was made the subject of a volume in the long-running series of notable British trials. The documents survive, legal papers, the county newspapers' full and vivid reporting, and even a framed collection of photographs and letters kept as souvenirs by one of the officers on the case, and preserved, generations later, in a museum. The physical evidence of the careful woman's undoing, the identifications, the shoemaker's testimony, passed into the permanent account of English criminal history, and yet the shape of that remembering carries its own quiet injustice, and the record ought to name it. The case is remembered as the case of Samuel Herbert Dougal. It is his name that titles the books and heads the entries. It is his career of forgery and deception and predatory appetite that the retellings dwell upon. It is the scoundrel, endlessly, who holds the center of the story that his crime created. Camille Holland, who kept her own accounts and corresponded with her own broker and guarded the title of her property against him to the last, survives in that telling largely as the occasion of his notoriety rather than as a person in her own right. The moneyed spinster, the victim, the body in the ditch, the woman known at the end by her shoes. She appears, in the account the world has kept, as an occasion, not a person. The record establishes her caution, her competence, and her single failure of judgment, and it establishes, too, that she was right about the one thing she insisted upon, and that being right did not save her. The shoes that named her, the garments and the jewelry, the title she held in her own name, these small survivals are, in the end, nearly the whole of what the record has let her keep. The case of Camille Cecile Holland was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1903. The case became part of the national record. It has not left.